requires us leadership to support the voices of change movement. We all embrace diversity by respecting and celebrating diversity in all its forms. We also contribute to creating a richer work environment. Everyone feels valued and respected by embracing inclusivity in the workplace. On this occasion, let us seize the opportunity to advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion through voices of change in the healthcare environment and beyond that positively impacts our families, communities, and South Africa.
Impactful messaging days from leaders at Khani as well as Pfizer, who are part of our partners for 2023 Voices of Change. Without further ado, this is one of the exciting parts of the program. It is the breakout session. You are spoiled for choice in these sessions because you have two formidable speakers to choose from. If you'd like to stay in the session in the studio, we have Jabu Zwani. And for the MS team session, we've also got David Gonsalves, and he'll be talking about love and respect. Now, David has gone from working in a butchery to driving trucks to becoming a successful psychologist. He's also a father of three and is fascinating, very interesting. So if you'd like to be a part of that session with David, he is already online. You may go through to the Business Engage website, and there is a link over there for the MS team session with David Gonsalves on love and respect. And if you'd like to stay in this session, we've got Joanne as successful and really wise and good, sharing some of his fascinating stories with us. Some fun facts that I learned about Joanne with that. He was stuck in the US during the lockdown period for 8 months. And during that time, he took a job as basically a gardener. He was cutting grass as a driver and cleaning houses. Now you see the man that's going to come on stage, obviously well put together, obviously very well smart. So how did he go from being widowed at the tender age of 37, starting over at 89, our house? He will be talking to us about minding your words and minding your mindset. So we want to say that. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome
Fantastic, David. Well, welcome and over to you. And yeah, the session's yours. You've got a number of people online, and guys, feel free to put messages in the chat and to ask questions. And I'm sure David's here to give you a great amount of wisdom. So please feel free to use the chat. Over to you, David.
Colleen, thank you so much, and Masa, in her online absence, thank you for a wonderful introduction. So, my name is David, like you've heard, and I'm a psychologist by profession. I've been in practice now for 22 years. I can't believe it's been that long, and it really is an honor for me to address you today on this topic, which, you know, the whole concept of he, she, we is power. I found quite refreshing because of what's going on. So I'm going to go through a little bit around, you know, what's happening today in the whole world of, you know, gender and how people deal with the differences in the genders. My main goal today is twofold. The first thing that I want to do is always when I speak to people is I'm hoping to finish speaking before you finish listening. And that's quite a big deal for me always. The second thing is, you know, it's a Friday afternoon, a beautiful sunny day outside. So this is not going to be a very heavy talk. But if I can just get you walking away with one gem, something that sticks in your mind that you can apply, you know, whether it's in your own relationships at home or your professional or work relationships, if I can just leave you with one gem, one little takeaway, then I'll feel like my job is done. So I've left a bit of time available at the end if anybody would like to make a comment or say anything. But you know, diving right in, the whole topic of genders is hotly discussed. In fact, in my opinion, I'm not sure there's a time when it's been more hotly discussed than it is right now. And when I say that, I'm referring to everything from the world of politics to all over social media. Social media is awash with some very, very passionate discussions and opinions. And no doubt there'll be people on this call also who've got some very passionate opinions around the whole topic of gender. You know, for many years, we struggled with the two genders. Today, we're struggling with, I don't know what the count is now, you know, over 100 or whatever it is, depending on who you ask. And certainly we live in a
David, have we lost you? Hi, David.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that.
Not
That
at all.
moment of panic. Are we all back? There we go. Okay, so we are back on, hey, Colleen?
Yes, you are.
Ah, okay. Geez, I'm
Thanks.
really sorry about that. We would have Murphy's Law, and we had a power failure. It's nothing to do with load shedding. Anyway, let me try and start off again. But as I said to you earlier, and I think you did at the beginning part, is this is a very hotly debated topic. The whole thing around genders, how many there are. And in fact, what I've begun to witness is that people are actually afraid to talk about this. People are afraid to talk about genders today more than they have been in a long time, because of the passion with which it often gets discussed. So in these next few minutes, like I said to you earlier before the power failure, is that my goal today is to just leave you with one gem and maybe just get us thinking a little bit, more constructively around where we are. The thing that we can all agree on is that something needs to be done. And when I say something needs to be done, if we consider the history of gender and where we've come from and so forth, it's been very, very interesting for me, not only looking at it from a professional point of view. I do a lot of sort of marriage counseling, relationship counseling, but also in terms of our history, as a people. Where have we come from with the whole gender debate, and where are we right now, and why should something be done? Why is Voices of Change so important? And I think it's absolutely crucial, especially at this time. I'm going to try and use personal stories just to illustrate a few points and maybe, carry the point across. But, my father, who's now late, he was an immigrant from a very sort of poor part of Europe, and, came to South Africa. His father, my grandfather, was an alcoholic, and he was kind of scary when we were kids because he only had one eye. And my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, whom I never met, because she passed away in her 40s, sadly, she was blind. And my grandfather was a violent alcoholic. And so it was, horrible stories, and I don't want to sort of turn down your Friday, but he was extremely abusive, and it was kind of a brutal setting in which to grow up. And my father fortunately learned from that and didn't repeat, those types of behaviors, thankfully. But there was a time where that kind of behavior, perhaps it wasn't tolerated, it was looked down upon, but nobody would really intervene in that kind of a brutal situation. So fortunately, we live in a time where it's those kinds of things are considered completely ridiculous, and people would one would hope step in a lot faster. My point is, times have changed and times have needed to change. My mom, who grew up in South Africa, did very well at school. She's very intelligent. I think she was head girl and that. And my grandfather, her father, who was also an immigrant, didn't believe that women should have tertiary education. So these are just, sort of 1.5 generations back, that things like that were easily believed and said. So for that reason, we do need to do something, because historically, there are still places today where women are not allowed to get driver's license or not allowed to be seen to be driving around on their own. So the truth is, we do need to address these things, but I see often there are people who come into kind of a stalemate when they don't know exactly how to address these things. Men in particular, I've noticed today, are perhaps afraid of even voicing their opinion because they're very afraid of being vilified or cancelled or whatever. So even in the field of psychology, as early as the 1970s began the whole debate of nature versus nurture. And if we apply that to the genders at the time as well, there was quite a robust debate as well around sort of boys and girls and development. Do boys become boys and play with cars and play with little toy guns because we buy them cars and toy guns? Do girls play with dolls and Barbie because we buy them dolls and Barbies and pink dresses? And there were even some experiments where they began to, attempt to be a lot more neutral with children in the developmental phases. And over time, we learned things. Over time, we learned in psychology that boys are in fact different, that if you just gave them sticks, they would fashion them into little weapons and things like that, or they would use stones in little makeshift roads in cars. So we do know that there are differences between the genders. We can't deny that. It's something that we see all the time. Psychology moved on, popular media moved on from the 70s. A book that I would doubt anyone on this call has never heard of before is the book by John Gray called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And that book went into, it kind of used humor and insight to kind of try and explain what are the differences, how are men and women opposed to each other. And the premise of the book is it's as if men and women are from two different planets, which would almost imply that there's a kind of a misfit between the genders, and that they're so different that it's as though they come from two different planets. And I always like to argue against that theory, really, because to me, while we can assume, or not assume, while we can know that there are very significant differences between men and women, we've also got to acknowledge that they're not in opposition to each other. In fact, you know, men and women are more like the yin and yang. You know, if you've seen that little yin and yang picture, is they're different, but they really do fit into each other in a really, really constructive way. And I mention that because we live in a world today, in certain sectors and certain voices, people are trying to completely obliterate the fact that there are differences between the genders. And, you know, my assertion is that that's a little bit reckless and a little bit out of touch with reality. There are significant differences between men and women, and these differences are not destructive. They are constructive and extremely valuable. And I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit with the few minutes that we have, you know, moving ahead from here. But really, in my opinion, men and women, the genders, they don't compete with each other. Together, they are complete. And it really does work out that way if you're just willing to look around, you know, in terms of many of our relationships that we're exposed to. A large part of my career has also been spent in the world of obesity. And in obesity, we deal with people's bodies in a very significant way. And so I began to work in what's in some sectors called super obesity, which is where people have, you know, it's not just people who are a little bit overweight, is they weigh many, sometimes many 100 kilograms overweight. And it's even significant on a physical level, the differences between men and women. You know, we all think we know what a man and a woman looks like. And I know, you know, this is, again, a very sensitive topic to be discussing because, you know, the aesthetic is not the most important thing. And that certainly remains very, very true. But what we noticed in the world of super obesity is that the higher somebody's body mass index became, in other words, if you took a man and a woman and you added 200 kilograms of body fat to each of those two people, if you cut out their heads from a picture and you saw their bodies unclothed, they would look almost identical. My point being is that with super obesity, there are so many hormonal issues that begin to happen. The women begin to develop a little bit more facial hair. The men develop less facial hair. The men develop something called gynecomastia. So their chests even begin to look the same. Their genitalia are completely covered by these bodies. What is my point? My point is that when we are healthy, when we are in the right state, when we're in a state of wellness, we are different. From a physical point of view, as well as behaviorally and the way that we process information, there are differences, and those differences are important to acknowledge. We cannot pretend something is not there when it is blatantly there. In the world of obesity as well, because we were able to reverse that obesity, it was incredible what began to happen specifically with our female patients, because when a lady loses a whole lot of body weight, she begins to feel better, she begins to look better, she begins to dress differently. And it became so apparent for many of our female patients, the power of her body. So it's incredibly shocking for many people who've lived with obesity their whole life, that in terms of our physical bodies, the amount of attention that a woman's body gets is incredible. Again, I'm walking between the minefields here to not, you know, step on any, but it's something that we have to acknowledge. People understand this in the world of marketing, in the world of, you know, aesthetics and things. So there are these differences. How do we deal with them? So the topic of my discussion today, this breakout session, was love and respect. And that really comes from a book called Love and Respect by Dr. Emerson Eggerich. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. In my 22 years of working as a psychologist, I've only ever seen 2 books that have gone as far as being very instrumental in saving a relationship, saving a marriage. And this is one of them. And it really is worth a buy. And I'm going to refer to this book kind of in terms of relationships. And I'm going to touch on a little bit, you know, in the world of work. Now, how this book came about, it's really interesting because there, just a short number of years ago, there was a survey being conducted. And the survey was trying to find the differences between men and women. And there were a bunch of items or questions in the survey that were, you know, the intention of which was to kind of figure out what are the fundamental differences. And the questions were sort of, you know, one or the other question, so that, you know, each of the questions had one of two answers that you needed to choose. It was binary. And the answers were quite mixed. There was one question that seemed to divide the genders very, very directly. And that question was, if you could only have one of the following, which would you choose? Love or respect? Now, when I heard the question, my immediate thought was, well, you know, if you're respected, it's kind of like being loved. And when I read the question to my wife, she was like, well, of course, you know, the answer is love. Who would choose respect if love was on the table? And this is exactly where the whole book came from. So the book was written, the writer of the book, this Dr. Eggerich, also has a pastoral background. So I'm not an expert on the Bible, and I don't profess to be that, but it was actually very interesting because in the book of Ephesians, now Ephesians is kind of in the New Testament. So once the apostles were walking around and spreading the word, as it said, Ephesus is a town you can still visit today. You can see the ruins. So the book of the Ephesians was a series of letters that were written 2,000 years ago to the people living in Ephesus. And there was some advice there on marriage. And what this apostle wrote was, he said, men, love your wives. Women, respect your husbands. And, you know, out comes this survey thousands of years later, and it's just randomly asking this question to a bunch of people, and the answers came back. So what happened in the survey was that the overwhelming majority of men chose respect. If they could only either have love or respect, they would have respect. The overwhelming majority of women chose love, and there was a fair percentage of the ladies also who chose respect. So, but it was interesting how almost all the men chose respect, most of the women chose love, and a percentage of them, instead of choosing love, chose respect, the ladies. What does this imply? Well, where I've seen this happen in relationships is quite interesting. And I'm going to use real examples. Obviously, I won't mention any names, but these are real people who've been to see me. And it became so obvious, especially after having read this book, that we can't not, you know, use this or take this as something that's very, very valuable in terms of how do we integrate the genders? How do they work together? How do they fit together in such a constructive way that there really is power in that diversity? For one example was a gentleman who worked for a very autocratic boss. And the boss had humiliated him in front of a group of employees. And he came home to his wife, and this became a huge contentious issue. He came home to his wife and he told her about this, and that he was furious and he felt humiliated. He felt disrespected. And his wife responded by saying, you know what, stuff your boss. What does he know? I think you're amazing. I love you. You know, so she was trying to be supportive, and she was really trying to help him and remind him that she loves him, and that, you know, at least he comes home to a home where he's loved. And it became an argument between the two of them. Now, for many people, they wouldn't understand, now, why did that become an argument? It became an argument because she responded with love. And what he wanted was respect. So, for example, had she said, hey, you know, your boss doesn't know anything. I respect you to the moon and back. You know, they may have disrespected you there, but there are so many other places, blah, 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 where you are respected. And that would have, you know, spoken to that part of him that deeply craves respect. These are not things that we want. These are things that we crave. They're almost primal. And so much of the differences between men and women are primal. And primal is old, it's ancient. So from this letter that was written 2,000 years ago to the survey that was done just a few short years ago, we need to understand in dealing with people, you know, how important different things are to the different genders. Much the same, another lady who I'd seen in therapy who had you know, quite an argument with a good, very close friend of hers. And she came home and she shared with her husband how she was kind of rejected from this group, and she found it very, very hurtful. And he just wanted to get on the phone with these people and tell them how silly they were, and kind of, muscle her back into the group. And she became so furious because all she wanted was for him to love her and for him to remind her that, you're loved here at home. So it's our human nature to answer people's needs with our own needs. So if I want love, I want to give you love. If I want respect, I want to give you respect. If I'm invested somehow in you emotionally. And it's a fascinating read. We don't have enough time today, but you can really workshop this book in so many contexts, love and respect, because what the book explains so beautifully is, yes, there are exceptions. Of course, women want to be respected. Of course, men want to be loved. We can't, it sounds like stating the obvious, but I've seen people kind of take offense to that. Of course, we both want both. But what's very relevant is that if you ask a random number of hundreds of different men and women that question, if you could only have one of the following, would you rather be loved or respected? It does tend to split the genders. And that split in the genders does tell us a lot about our nature. And it begins to teach us how people relate to each other, in these different contexts. And I was, thinking about some examples as well in terms of work, because the book is really useful around relationships, specifically around marriages and around, the male and female relationship. We are different. We've got to acknowledge that, and we've got to learn about that difference and how to navigate that. Earlier this week, I was at a funeral, and it's the gentleman who is kind of an acquaintance of mine, but he's very close to two of my siblings. And so I went along to this funeral, and I'll tell you the story. It's quite tragic. It's a gentleman who 2 weeks and a day after turning 50, he passed away. He was married for 25 years, had not had any children. Now, this gentleman had grown up and started a business from a young age. Now, this is quite an interesting example about how this applies in the workplace. This gentleman built a huge business in the world of auto repair. So he basically, if your car has an accident, you go to your insurance company and they send it to this guy. Now, that industry, if you know anything about it, is extremely male dominated. It's very much a masculine industry. It's quite a tough industry. It's a hard knuckle industry to survive in. And this gentleman had built a substantial business in that field. And once the business had gotten to a certain point, and they were talking about this in one of the eulogies, it kind of just stuck there. His wife, very feminine, lovely lady, had her own successful corporate career in her own right. And what she did was she left her career some years ago and joined him in his business. And it was fascinating to me listening to the stories, around the tea and the coffee tables, because what had happened was this lady who knew nothing about, spray painting a car, any of those things, joined him in this extremely male-dominated, business. And together they grew this business to such a degree that it surpassed all of its earlier markets. It was interesting listening to what happened, because she didn't go there and turn into another him. She didn't go there and revolutionize the business or anything in that regard in terms of, bumping him out and making herself more important or anything like that. She added an element that he needed. She didn't change herself. She walked in there and built a role for herself around herself in all of those attributes that are so, that were really missing in this business. And it was very tragic. He passed away so young and so suddenly. But that is something that I see in many, many work and business contexts. Men and women are not the same. And the fact that they're different, therein lies power. And I mention that over and over because we are living in a time today where people are very vocal about the differences and about the pluses and minuses of the two sides, which one is better, who is more disadvantaged in the past, and all of those things. And how do we correct that? How do we, recompense people for perhaps those difficulties in the past? And, something that I've been working on a lot with people in terms of relationships is You can't change the other person to your gender. You can't change them onto your agenda. What we need to do is we need to learn about the person on the other side of that line and learn how to work constructively. And this book has taken an ancient design and put on that ancient design a modern perspective. You know, so from 2,000 years ago to today, there are certain truths that survive. By the same token, 1.5 generations back, certainly in my, lineage, and probably for many of you on this call, 1.5, 2 generations back, there were massive changes. So there are certain truths that survive through time, and there are certain situations that we need to apply. When we are extremely vocal and almost militant about these things, we run the risk of repeating history. You know, when these are on top of them, those are on top of that's never constructive. Rather, let's apply some of that old wisdom and look at the wisdom that survives and apply that in new contexts, because there is massive, massive power in diversity, which so makes me appreciate the topic of today's discussion. So there are a few, different examples. What we've decided to do, because it's a breakout session, is to leave it there. If there are any comments or questions, we've left a bit of time available to that. So the way we've set up the system is you are welcome to unmute yourself or raise a hand if you have any questions or suggestions. Yeah, I mean, I really do want to suggest to anybody who's in a relationship or in a work relationship to have a look at this book, Love and Respect by Emerson Eggerich. It really is. I can't believe people haven't read this book, because what I see is people stumbling over and over and over on the same issues and problems. And there are solutions to these things. There really, really are. And there's no reason to be getting stuck the way that I see people getting stuck all the time. So at this stage, I'd like to open this up to anybody. Are there any questions, suggestions, or anything like that in terms of you guys on the call?
Any questions from anybody on the call? No?
No. Okay.
No. Fantastic. Do you have anything closing you want to say, David, or?
Yes, in closing, very briefly, the other thing I find, Colleen, is often an issue with people is an unwillingness to ask difficult questions. Because these issues are so vocalized and there's so much chaos. Chaos brings fear. And what I'm finding in practice all around me is when people are afraid, they don't raise their questions, they don't ask questions. So I would encourage everyone on this call, specifically around the sensitivity around gender and gender differences, ask the questions, ask them in constructive ways, ask the questions. See, there is a question here from Richard. Hi, David. Do you know why the small majority of women chose respect? Well, there are several theories, Richard, on why. So Richard's question is, so you had these two options, love or respect, and a few women chose respect. The majority chose love. There are different theories on that, Richard. Is it Richard or Raylene? I'm not sure. But one of the theories, sadly, is that many women, because of the history that I've mentioned, have been through histories of whether that's mental, emotional, verbal, or physical abuse. And, in the process of that, because of their hurt and their pain, they chose respect. That's the one theory. It's very difficult to kind of figure out, what's the actual truth. So the one theory is that from past hurt, people have chosen respect, especially when they've been disrespected or hurt through that. And the other theory is just that, people are not the same. Some people just value that, or they view respect as sort of including love. And it's just like Fazana said over there, respect underpins love. And sometimes it does. So, you can't really have love without respect. Otherwise, it's kind of an incomplete love. But if you look at the item, the question, it was designed to really sort of split people, force your thoughts to split and go, if I could only have one, which one would I include? Which one would I choose rather? But certainly, respect and love can't really be separated. But it was just interesting to the researchers that particular question, unlike all of the others that were binary, that was the one that completely or closely split the genders. So, yeah, certainly it doesn't mean that somebody doesn't want love if they chose respect or vice versa. We'd never want to suggest that. But it was just very, very interesting that that's what split the genders more than any other binary question.
Fantastic. Any other comment? I do see that there's one other comment from Fazan, and she says respect underpins love, which is
surely does.
Very true. Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments or questions for David? Fantastic. Okay, David, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And everybody, we're back in the studio after David, so we'll see you back just now. Thank you so much once again, David. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for your time. Thanks, Colleen. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.